et le tester avant. Yes, I think we are live now. Yeah, great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new webinar by MoroccoAI Webinars. I have the pleasure to have with us Dr. Afaf Taïk. I will read you her biography first. So, Afaf is currently a Claire Deschênes and FRQNT postdoctoral fellow at Mila Quebec AI Institute, working on the intersection of fairness and privacy in machine learning. She has obtained a PhD in electrical engineering in June 2022 from Université de Sherbrooke, where she worked on problems related to distributed machine learning algorithms in wireless networks. Before that, she obtained a DESS from Université de Sherbrooke and a software engineering degree from NCS. And she's a very valuable member of the Morocco AI community, and she collaborated with Morocco AI and helped us at the organization of several events like the summer school, like the conference. So I'm personally very happy to be the host of today's webinar. And thank you again very much, Dr. Afaf, for accepting the invitation. And I'm very looking forward to your presentation, which has the title Understanding and Navigating Bias in Machine Learning. Very, very important subject. So thanks again, Dr. Afaf. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Rodwan, for the kind introduction. So without further ado, I'll just dive into the presentation. As Rodwan said, it's titled Understanding and Navigating Bias in Machine Learning. So my outline is as follows. I will start by introducing the problem and then talking about socio-technical harms of machine learning systems. And then I'll discuss biases in the AI lifecycle before moving into talking about how to attain fairness in machine learning, and then some successes, failures, limitations, and trade-offs. So as you all know, machine learning is everywhere. I'm not the first person to tell you, and you probably know that it's from a larger scale in smart cities and smart factories into smaller scale where it interacts with us end users through machine learning translation, in e-commerce, in social media, and most recently with the rise of chatbots like ChatGPT. Machine learning is also used in some in some applications with high social impact, like CV screening, deciding who gets loans, who gets insurance, but also who gets released from jail and who gets more surveillance. And this is mostly done in these applications because machine learning models were believed to be more objective. But piles and piles of headlines and failures over the years say otherwise. You have sexist hiring tools, predictive policing with machine learning is being racist, mortgage applicants are being denied just because of their race, and so on and so forth. And this is so infrequent, actually, that we needed to create a taxonomy of all the harms that machine learning does. So I'll start by using this categorization of harms, starting with representational harms, quality of service harms, allocative harms, interpersonal harms, and social system harms, which was proposed by René Chalvet at AIES last year. So the first type of harms, which is representational harms, refers to stereotyping and misrepresenting social groups. My favorite example to use for this category is the Barbie examples that were generated by BuzzFeed. So they thought they were being cute and quirky and sharing this cool list of a Barbie from each country of the world. But what this list showed is actually that the generative AI used, which was Midjourney, has some inherent misrepresentation, but also some bad stereotypes that are embedded in it. For example, the one from Tajikistan was blonde. All the Barbies from the Middle East were wearing men attire, and worse stereotypes were Barbies from South Sudan and Lebanon that were related to themes with violence and war, with the one from South Sudan carrying a gun and the one from Lebanon standing on rubbles. Moving from representational harms, which might not look like they have a huge impact, this is just a Barbie example, we have quality of service harms, where people are not being considered during the development of machine learning models and services. So you have VR headsets that give women more cyber sickness than men, and you have speech recognition technologies that don't work well, both for in terms of race and gender, where it has a huge disparity because of accents and because of the pitch. And another example is this misfortunate bot that was used by New Zealand for passports that was asking people from Asian descent to open their eyes. So this causes alienation and service loss and service quality loss. Like you bought a speech recognition device, like you bought an Alexa or a Google Home, you want it to work well, but unfortunately it might not work for you as well as it works for a certain other demographic group. Next, we also have allocative harms. Allocative harms refer to harms like losing opportunities or losing social welfare even. Like Amazon having developed a sexist AI tool which would always reject women. There were some algorithms known to deny food help to people or mortgage applications. And these three categories, they can be, we can actually say that they are more related to some systemic biases that were either in the data or in the systems. But machine learning also enabled some harms that actually make people lose their agency, like generating child porn and sextortion cases. But we also have like advertising companies that would harass women who are pregnant with baby ads. And someone even said that these algorithms hacked into women's wombs, because this is a very sensitive information, and sometimes algorithms figure these things out just through seeing patterns in the browsing history of women. The final kind of harm is social system harm, which is more at the society level. So that also includes economic harms, political harms, and environmental harms. I will only focus in this presentation on the first three types of harms, which are representational, quality of service, and allocative harms. And so for this, I asked the question, can we identify the source of these harms? So the main cause is bias. And to navigate this, we'll just go through a simple example. Let's say we trained a model, and the model was trained on data that was collected from two groups, one that constitutes 90% of the population and one that constitutes 10% of the population. And we sampled the data to reflect this, and we trained our model. Let's say this model is for loan applications or for like college admissions. And our model, we tested it, it's 95% accurate, it's good enough. We think we should deploy it. Why not? Well, if we zoom in, we find that for group one, it's 95% accurate, but for group two, it's only 50% accurate. And so we can clearly say that this is mainly biased against group two. And just before I move forward, let's actually define bias. So in the dictionary, bias refers to prejudice toward toward or against a person or a group. In machine learning, we usually use bias, like in the bias variance trade-off, to refer to any systematic error. But in this presentation, I actually talk about bias in the lens of algorithmic fairness, where it refers to systemic errors that result in an unfair model. So going back to our example, what we can see is maybe the cause is because we have unbalanced data. And usually data is considered as the main culprit in unfair systems. We have a lack of representation, and that happens in many models that we have, like for instance, the large language models nowadays, they don't work as well for low resource languages as they work for English. We also have ImageNet, where most of the data is coming from a North American and Western perspective. And this is what we refer to as selection bias. We also have label bias. Well, the fact that mechanical Turk workers are all coming from certain geographic locations, that leads to workers that don't have enough knowledge to label the data correctly. An example is this wedding pictures examples that are correctly labeled for white Western weddings, but for an African couple, it just says person, people, because the workers lack the context, they lack the knowledge. And so there have been a lot of debates in the community actually about where these biases are coming from. And many people really tag data as the main culprit. However, some recent papers actually showed that models amplify the biases. So you might have an unbalanced data set with like a majority of women being in the kitchen. However, if you take a model that tries to recognize whether a person in a kitchen is a man or a woman, it will probably try to overgeneralize and label the person as a woman because it's more likely to get a better accuracy. And so to have a wider view, actually, bias exists in data and it exists in models, but the way it exists varies depending on which time of the life cycle we're trying to look at it. So we have historical biases. The data used for several applications is basically collected from real life, from people who made decisions. So we have historical bias. And we also have representation bias. So we sampled from this data and we sampled in a biased way. Like we biased from certain places of the world where we had access to data. We sampled from like the areas that we had access to. Next on, we have measurement bias, where we try, for example, to approximate some certain attribute that we don't have access to. For example, the income. We would use proxy attributes of a certain area and then give it to an individual from that area. And that creates a biased data set. And then comes the developers, the people working in machine learning. They would define models, and the models usually, they actually have their own biases in the definition of the problem, which would propagate throughout the training and then also during the evaluation, because we all have blind spots. So we usually miss something. We are sometimes might not be aware that there are two groups of people who are impacted differently. And then this also creates models that would be adopted and then deployed, and the way people interact with them. Like, let's say an agent uses a model to predict whether someone would default on their loan or not. The the decision in the end will be made by a human. And the way they interpret the output of the model is also subject to their own biases. And this in turn impacts the world, which again creates historical biases and so on. So knowing that bias exists, we know that it's a bad thing, right? But we want to mitigate it. So we have to define what is fair. What is fair is kind of hard to define, actually. So I'll take the classic example of Google search, Google searching in Google image. The word CEO would give you 83% of images that are of men. So this is nowhere near 50% representation of women. However, in reality, the number of women that are CEOs is actually much less than the ones you get in the results. So what is more fair, to have 50-50, to have what exists in the real world? So when looking at the literature and what we should be fair with respect to, you can also look at the law to know what you should not be biased against. And you find that there is, depending on where you are, but there are some certain attributes that the laws focus on. However, there's like a general agreement that there shouldn't be any prejudice against gender, age, marital status, religion, and like knowing that, for example, the groups are defined based on gender or defined based on race or an intersection of these two attributes, we can move on to actually try to measure the bias between groups. However, it's still a hard problem, because in the literature, like by 2018, and just in the case of binary classification, there were over 18 definitions. And the definitions have two main categories. The first one is group fairness, where we try to treat the groups similarly. And another one is called individual fairness. So let's say Radwan and I have the exact same qualifications. If we apply to a job, we should have a quite similar output, like a quite similar probability, because we only vary in gender and not in something that matters for that application. Just to give you an example of some of the group fairness definitions that exist, I took 3 examples. The first one is demographic parity, which only focuses on the outcome of the model. So we try to, considering A is a protected attribute referring to whether the person is male or female, comparing the probability of a positive outcome should be the same. There's also equalized odds, which also considers the ground truth in the data. And there is predictive parity, which actually focuses on accuracy instead. And here comes a dilemma. The dilemma is how to choose a fairness metric. So there's this famous case of Compass and ProPublica that actually stirred a lot of discussion in the fairness community, where Compass, which is a tool that predicts whether a person will commit a crime again if they are released out of jail, and which is used in the US. It was developed by a company called Northpoint, and Northpoint claims that they are accurate and fair based on the accuracy parity metric. However, ProPublica, which does investigative journalism, says that Compass has a higher false positive rate for Black people. And so this gives like that how we view the machine learning systems in terms of fairness really creates a huge difference on whether a system is fair or not. And so actually, when we wanted to choose which fairness definition to use, we have to think of the consequences of our choices. So for example, false negatives are better than false positives, like in spam detection. For example, if you receive an email and it's a spam and it's in your main, you would just say, oh, it's just annoying, but you delete it, then it's fine. But if an important email goes to your spam, you might miss an important opportunity, a job interview, a scholarship, something like that. So really the outcome or the impact of a false negative is really less important than a false positive in this case. However, we have cases where false positives are actually better than false negatives. For example, if we have an automatic sanitization for text, for example, or for images, and if we forget to remove something sensitive like your credit card information, your social security number, it's less, it's more dramatic actually than accidentally removing thank you or a less sensitive text. So it's really a matter of really thinking about the consequences and the kind of harm that might happen with an error. There is also something that I've thought a lot about through the different some applications that I've worked on over the past year, including fair vaccination strategies, where if we think about it, sometimes what is fair is not actually what is equal. What is fair is to prioritize the people who need some resource more, like vaccines. We would prioritize older people because they are more at risk. And what would be also fair in dynamic pricing applications is to prioritize people who need the more preferential prices, like in public transport, where we would give more preferential rates for students and elderly people than the people who are actually in the workforce and who can actually afford to buy the bus pass, for example. Also, it's important to choose which fairness definition to use because we have the fairness impossibility theorem. And that actually says that we cannot satisfy multiple fairness definitions at once. You don't really need to know what these definitions are, but just to show you that the amount of possibilities is far less than the amount of impossible combinations. And so let's say we define what fairness is. How can we achieve it? So as we said, like bias exists throughout the machine learning pipeline. And it's only fair to say that we need to mitigate it at every step of the pipeline. So for that, we have pre-processing, in-processing, and post-processing techniques. So to give you some examples, for pre-processing, we modify data before training. And some of the techniques that exist for that are massaging, where we might rank individuals from the different groups and then move the decision boundary and flip the labels of the ones that are closer to the decision boundary from the deprived group to a more positive label. We also have reweighting. In the case of highly unbalanced data, we give more weight to the positive labels from the deprived group so that they are more likely to be selected during the training. And lastly, we also have data augmentation, where we can add counterfactual examples. In the example of large language models, we can add data that is less frequent, like he was a nurse and girls are good at soccer, things, because the text data is very gender biased. We have in-processing techniques which include modifying the algorithm that is trained. And for that, we can add fairness as a constraint. So instead of just minimizing the loss function, we can add the constraint of having demographic parity, for example. But since constraint optimization in machine learning is not always possible and not always easy, we can add the fairness, the gap, we can add it as a regularizer to our loss function. And we can also think of it as an adversarial debiasing terms where we train a model that tries to predict the label, and then an adversary that tries to predict the sensitive attribute, and then use that to actually remove this bias from our predictions. And lastly, we have post-processing techniques, which modify the predictions of the model. So this does not require changing the data before, but it changes the outcome of the model. We can adjust the threshold. Like for each demographic group that we have, we can have a different threshold to make the decisions fair. And we can also make the predictions, but flip them if we don't like the outcome and it does not match our fairness expectations. Each of these techniques has some pros and cons, like the ease of implementation and reuse. Pre-processing techniques are mostly easy to implement, scalable. All the techniques are basically easy to audit because we only look at the outcome. However, pre-processing and in-processing techniques give us more flexibility, while post-processing gives like hard, if we put a constraint, we will have the exact constraint. There is no room to adjust because we lose a lot of utility when we try to adjust for fairness. And also in terms of generalizability, pre-processing and in-processing are easier to adapt than post-processing techniques for various applications. And so I will end this by mentioning that there is no free lunch. So there's always a trade-off between fairness and accuracy. We cannot have an ideal situation where our model is both fair and accurate. Unless our data is perfect and our model definition is perfect, and that would require a perfect world. And we have a potential clash with privacy because in order to collect the protected attribute, that violates some privacy requirements. And also because of privacy requirements, sometimes we get a bad impact on the performance across different groups, especially if we use differential privacy. And finally, I just want to say that fairness should not be an afterthought, and it should not be just another metric. There is this trend that I've been seeing where fairness has been added to dashboards alongside some other metrics that are very odd, like ethics and non-toxicity. And that makes metric becoming like fairness has become a target, and it didn't become like something that we actually look at and think about. And also the generative AI missed the mark in many products, because usually what happens is we train on whatever data we find, on huge amounts of data, without really verifying its quality, without removing the bad stereotypes. And then we just fine tune on some small data sets that are more curated for alignment and ethics and fairness. And then we say, great, we have a high score. We did a good job, and we pat ourselves on the shoulder, and then we call it a day. That actually is just like putting a band-aid on a deeper issue. And so I would hugely advocate for developing more data-aware approaches for future developments. And that's all for me. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Dr. Afaf, for this very nice and instructive webinar. I personally learned a lot. So yeah, did receive a lot of questions actually, and please don't hesitate to ask other questions in the meanwhile. So I'll start maybe with a question regarding your slides also. So can you please explain the maximal fairness idea?
Sure. So before, like in around 2017, we were only talking about impossibility theorems. And people were just saying you cannot satisfy multiple fairness definitions at once. And this paper that was presented last year at FACT actually tried to show and to look for possible combinations. However, they ended up finding a lot of impossible combinations, but they also showed that there are some metrics that can be satisfied at once. And they usually use the confusion matrix to show the possibility. Also, there are some papers that relax the fairness constraint. Like instead of saying we want ultimate equality between the groups, we just want like the gap not to be over a certain threshold. And that makes it more possible to have more fairness definitions being satisfied. I feel like the research in this direction is more to just push the limit, but usually it's just one definition that would be adopted. And we usually wait for regulation or for auditors or some standards to give us which definition to use, which is still very behind.
In practice, that's what happens. We wait for our regulate. Okay. Very interesting. Yeah, for the next questions, I think these are like more philosophical questions, but yeah, I can start with this one. So, can fairness be related to specific cultures?
Yes, that's actually a great question. Fairness depends on the context, it depends on the values of the people, and it depends on how they view justice. Because sometimes like different cultures would see justice differently. Like, for instance, you would have some programs that define quotas for people who were historically marginalized, and that is what is fair. But that definition would only be useful in that area of the world, like having more scholarships for people, for indigenous people in North America, for example, or giving more help in some certain areas is what is more fair.
Yeah, thanks for your answer. I have actually 2 or 3 questions which are very similar, so I'll try to mix them to not take a lot of time. So the question is the following: what if the data present a fundamental difference? Do we consider that as a bias? And if the bias really comes from the data sets or the algorithm?
So the data, if it is biased, yes, we consider it biased. We try to mitigate it as soon as we know. But also we have to make sure that the algorithm is not biased, and that's a very hard thing to spot sometimes because of how we define it. But we can spot it if our model amplifies, for example, or amplifies the model at the end. So yes, data, and this is where pre-processing techniques come for data, and also where in-processing techniques come from the model. So both can be biased. I'm not sure if this answers the question.
Okay. Yeah, we have the breakout session later if the person wants to ask and maybe go on with that question. So I'll just try to move to the other questions because time is pressing. Fairness becoming a target, what is the issue with that?
So the issue with that is that we have another kind of bias, which is the benchmark and evaluation bias. So if I make you can create a benchmark and say, I had a good score on this, and then like you don't make more verifications that can actually lead. That is actually a biased thing to do. I'm not sure how to explain it more, but benchmarks themselves are not perfect, and they have a lot of blind spots because of the people who developed them. There are a lot of benchmarks for large language models, and if you look at them, you would find weird categories. There is one, I think it's called Toxygen. It has a category Muslim, Mexican, Black. It's really a weird mix of groups that are created. So having a good score on this benchmark, for example, does not mean anything.
Yeah, sure. It's really weird. Well,
Yeah.
yeah, the next question is the following. Do you see an improvement in the models regarding dealing with biases? You have shown, for example, the BuzzFeed images using Midjourney. Do you think if we might have the same results if we regenerate the same pictures, I mean, right now in 2024?
That's a good question. I, from what I've seen, is just I'm not very familiar with the generative image models. I don't explore them as much, but for large language models, it was the fact that they've become less biased and more safe that made them safe to be released to the public. If you compare the answers of Llama 1 versus Llama 2, for example, you will find a huge difference. Llama 1 is rude and toxic and absolutely terrible, while Llama 2 is more sophisticated, not just in terms of the quality of output, in terms of the text itself, but also it's really many degrees less biased. It's still biased. It's just like many degrees better. So I expect this maybe to get better, but we need more robust practices to achieve this.
All right. Well, this leads me to the next question because it's related to LLMs, but it's a very general question. So, can you say a few words on the impact of the LLM revolution, the impact on the fairness ML domain?
I don't think it had any change in impact because just recently LLMs that were used for CV screening were shown to have the same biases that existed in binary classification, classical models. And I've seen many papers and articles about this. So I don't think that it had, if it had any impact, it was not visible, I guess.
All right. Yeah, let me just like ask two last questions. Okay. The first one, these are like a very, very general questions again. What do you recommend for anyone who would like to work in your field?
I would recommend to roll up your sleeves and start because we need more people, especially from our area, to work on it. Honestly, we were looking at LLMs and we found them like the biases against Muslims are the most dominant ones still. So please, if you want to work, just start. And also,
Yeah.
it takes some resilience because for a while, the area of fairness in machine learning was not taken seriously up until recently, where the general public started interacting with models, and that's where more people started seeing biases. And then it started becoming more alarming. So if you can, just start. Yeah.
All right. And related to this is like a personal question. I wanted to know if you can recommend like maybe some materials, a specific material, a specific book, a specific maybe tutorial on the internet. Do you have like a classic maybe textbook or a classic? Video, maybe YouTube video also. Don't know.
There is this book that I've read when I was exploring the area of trustworthy machine learning, which is called Trustworthy Machine Learning by
Mm-hmm.
Kush
Mm-hmm.
Varshney. It
Okay.
actually has an overview also on privacy, robustness, and it's quite it has the necessary math, but really just the necessary. And I think it's available online
Okay.
for free. The PDF is free. Um, yeah, usually this is what I would recommend actually for the entire area.
Okay.
Although it only focuses on binary classification, but it's a good introduction for the intuition.
All right. If you can share it with me, and I'll be
Okay.
pleased to share it with the audience. And the very last question, because time is pressing. Um, so the question is, let me check it again. Yes, it's about conferences. So what are the main conferences of your domain, apart from like the top AI conferences out there, like specific conferences or specific
Um,
workshops on the
if
fair
you
on
see
ML
my
fairness? Ah, yeah.
my
Yeah, I
slide,
see. Yeah.
ACM fair, it's called FACT. That one is a top conference, and there's AIES. It's called
Mm-hmm.
AI Ethics and Society. It's also an ACM triple AI conference. And there's IAMO. I forgot what it stands for, but these are the main three conferences.
Okay. Okay. Well, that was the last question. And again, thank you very much, Dr. Afaf, for this very informative webinar. And thanks to everyone who attended this webinar. So now I will stop the sharing on YouTube, and we will continue with a breakout session where you can ask your questions directly to our speaker. So it's like a kind of a ask me anything session. So yeah, people who are watching us from YouTube, thank you very much, and please keep in touch again with MoroccoAI on Slack, LinkedIn.